Well, good evening. It's time to get started with our class tonight. If you would be opening your Bibles to Revelation chapter 13. Revelation chapter 13, we're going to begin at the beginning of the chapter. Revelation chapter 13. Jared, would you lead our prayer tonight, please? Amen. Last Wednesday night, those of you that were able to be here, you may remember that in introducing chapter 13, I said that we were going to look at this chapter a little bit differently than we have other passages in the book of Revelation, in that we're going to split this chapter up into two sections. And rather than look at it verse by verse, we're going to look at it section by section. And last week we read verses 1 through 10, kind of an introduction to this first thought, looking at this first of two beasts that are described in chapter 13. But as we saw, and we're not going to go back and read these verses again, but what I want us to do tonight is get into the discussion of what we see in these verses. And you may remember that I said over the week to be looking at and thinking about these verses and considering those in light of some of the things that we've already discussed from the book of Revelation, and try to come to a conclusion in your mind of who this first beast is referring to. We mentioned last week the fact that we can easily see that this is not referring to Satan himself. There are some that try to pass this off and say that this is not talking about a literal entity, but it's talking about Satan himself. Well, we see Satan represented in chapter 12 as the great dragon who made war with the remnant of the woman's seed. We talked about this being Christians, this being the church, after the church had come into establishment. But in verse 2, you notice that it says that the dragon gave power to this beast. So in this we see that the beast is not the dragon himself, but this beast is one that is doing the work of Satan. He is an evil entity who has been given power and authority from the dragon. But in verse 4, it says that the heads of the beast worshipped the dragon. And so once again, we see this is differentiating this beast from Satan himself, because whoever is pictured or symbolized here by this first beast is pictured as worshiping Satan, worshiping the devil. And so this beast cannot be Satan himself, because his power, his authority, his abilities, and also we see his allegiance and his worship is all tied to Satan. But we see that this is a separate entity. It is one that is doing the work of Satan. So in a way we could say that Satan is the enabler of this beast. He is the one that is guiding. He is the one that is directing the actions of this beast. And so from the outset we can eliminate Satan from consideration. Satan is not the one that is being described here as this first beast. Well, verse 1 of Revelation chapter 13 starts with a continuance of the sentence that we ended chapter 12 with. John sees an image of the dragon. This dragon, of course, being Satan. And notice it says that he is standing on the sands beside the sea, and the beast is coming forth from the sea. Well, interestingly, the symbolism that we see here used for this first beast. Now keep in mind, in chapter 13, we're going to see two different beasts. We're going to see a beast that comes from the sea and a beast that comes from the land. And so starting out here in verses 1 through 10, we're talking about the beast that John saw come forth from the sea. Well, the symbolism that we see here, we see used also in Daniel chapter 7, verses 2 through 8. And it's used to represent a ruler, one who has authority over a nation or over a system of government. And we see Daniel using this same type of imagery, especially this imagery of different types of animals, as he represents the four world empires that he set forth in his vision, that being Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then ultimately Rome. But look at the animals that are mentioned here in these first 10 verses. It talks about a leopard, a bear, and a lion. Well, the fact that we see all three of these combined together more than likely is an indication of the fact that the Roman Empire was seen somewhat as an amalgamation or an assimilation of these three previous empires. What you found was that when Babylon fell to the Medes and the Persians, there were certain Babylonian influences that carried over into the Medo-Persian Empire. When the Medo-Persian Empire fell to Greece, there were certain aspects or characteristics of that empire that carried over into the Grecian Empire led by Alexander the Great. But then when the Romans came in and conquered Greece, we see that there was some of that Hellenistic culture, especially some of the language and the customs that carried over into the Roman Empire. And so many times when people look at this and they see a leopard and a bear and a lion all pictured here, we know in Daniel they were used to refer to three different empires. Well, here we see the three all grouped together referring to one entity. And so, more than likely, what we are seeing is an image of the Roman Empire because they were, as I said, an amalgamation or an assimilation of all of these other empires that they had conquered up to that point. You know, one way that we could illustrate this, you know, oftentimes we talk about the United States being a nation of immigrants. And we talk about all of the different cultures that we see. You know, just take Randolph County, for instance, and look at the different cultures that we have just in our community now. But they are all assimilating together into what we know today as our American culture. You go to certain larger cities and you see different districts in those cities that generally have a demographic of people that have all come from a certain lineage. Well, just because they are still there and they're still practicing certain customs does not mean that they are not assimilating some into our American culture. You know, you think about it somewhat from the standpoint of the foods that we eat today. How many of the foods that we eat can we look at and say these are truly American dishes? Truly things that originated here on this continent? Very little. I mean, most of the things that we see are things that have ultimately came from other cultures, but they became a part of our culture. And so this is what we see taking place here. This is what we saw with Rome. As they conquered all of these other nations, they saw things that they liked. They saw things that they thought would better their society. And so they adopted those things into their developing Roman culture. But in this description that we see, in this vision that John sees, notice the language that he uses is that comes from the Old Testament. Those that had a knowledge of the Old Testament, and especially the writings of Daniel, would have known immediately what this was alluding to. They would have immediately recognized, well, that sounds just like what Daniel was talking about. That sounds just like these other nations. Well, they understood what this was referring to. And we can see by breaking this down that in this image, the most logical thing is this is talking about this world empire that was in place at the time. It's talking about Rome. But also, something that we've talked about quite a lot since we've been studying Revelation. We have to remember that much of this book was written in such a way that the Romans would have no clue what it was talking about. Most of this was written in such a way that if they did not have a knowledge of Old Testament scriptures, and particularly of prophecy, then they weren't going to understand it. And the reason it was done that way was so that if these writings fell into the hands of the Romans, it would not cause them to impose greater persecution upon Christians. They would not be able to recognize that this is talking about destruction that's ultimately going to come upon Rome. And so it's being written in a way that those who had a knowledge of Old Testament figures of speech and Old Testament language, they would be able to understand it. But let's look more closely at this vision. When we look at John's description of this beast, we see Satan standing upon the seashore, standing upon the sand of the sea. Most people say that this is more than likely referring to the Tyrrhenian Sea, which bordered the territories of Italy and had Rome as its capital, right there located along the Tiber River, which flowed into this sea. So here we see this image of Satan. He's standing here in this place of prominence, a place that would have been very well known to those in the Roman Empire as the center of their government. But in this, notice it says that from out of the sea comes this beast. Satan is standing there in the place of prominence, and the beast comes to him, receives power, receives authority, and he begins to rule. Well, whenever we look at what Jesus reveals about Satan in Matthew chapter 4, verses 8 and 9, we see that this perfectly aligns with the knowledge that Satan is the one that is giving this power. Satan is the one that is bringing all types of attacks against the church, or as referred to as the seed of woman. And so, in this, we see the close proximity of the dragon to the beast, indicating that the beast is doing the work of Satan. But remember who this is being written to. It's being written mainly to people who were former Jews. It's being written mainly to people who had been scattered abroad from Jerusalem originally. They scattered throughout the Roman Empire because the first forms of persecution that they were suffering was at the hands of the Jews. And so they've scattered throughout the Roman Empire. Many of them are from a Jewish lineage. Of course, by this time you have Gentiles that are being added to the church as well. But with the Hebrews, they were a very superstitious people. You remember the time when the disciples were out in a boat on the Sea of Galilee, and they look up and they see Jesus walking out across the water. You remember what it was that they said? They said it's his spirit or his ghost. They said it can't be him physically. Man can't walk on water. So it was their superstitions. They were saying this must be the Spirit of Christ that has separated from his body. They were a very superstitious people. And so, whenever the Hebrews thought about the sea or the ocean, they always pictured this as something that was dangerous, something that was tumultuous, something that could not be controlled, something that had a lot of destructive power. And so whenever they saw this image, or John saw this image of this beast coming forth from the sea, well, first off, when the Hebrews read that, immediately when they saw this mention of the sea, they would have known that based on their superstitions, this is something that's ominous. This is something that's dangerous. Great danger and destruction are going to surround anything that comes forth from the sea. But then they take that and they couple it with the fact of who's on the seashore waiting to receive the beast. The dragon. Satan. He's the one that's standing there waiting to influence this beast. You know, David, he wrote in Psalm 29 about a great storm. And in this, he's talking about it figuratively, but he's doing this in such a way that the Jews would understand. In Psalm 29, he talks about a great sea or a great storm that blew inland from the sea. And this storm was so strong that it came into Lebanon and it leveled many of these great cedars of Lebanon, these great, strong, tall trees that were there. Well, in this, we see that what he was showing is that God has great strength and great power. But also Daniel used this same imagery of the sea when he talks about these 4 great beasts. And of course, we know from talking about this, it's talking about these empires arising in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 3. But I want you to particularly notice Daniel 7 and verse 7. He said, "After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it, and it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns." Not everyone agrees what this image was that Daniel was witnessing. But from my studies, I think the most logical description that we see, or the most logical explanation, is that Daniel was witnessing the rise of the Roman Empire. And certainly Jewish Christians who were well versed in the Old Testament, they would instantly see a parallel here. They would instantly recognize, this is something that I've heard before. This is an image that's familiar to me. How many times have we heard someone make a statement, or maybe we were watching TV and a quote was given or something, and something triggered in our mind and it made us think, I think that's from the Bible. I think they're quoting a Bible verse, or even I think I've read that somewhere before. Well, that was the whole purpose. They were drawing in these parallels, helping them to recognize, this is what Daniel was talking about. This was what was prophesied hundreds of years prior to this time. We'll notice some more of the vision. Notice it said that this beast had 10 heads, or it had 10 horns with a diadem or a crown upon each one, 7 heads with the name of blasphemy on them. Now let me share a little bit of information with you from history that I think will shine some light on what these 10 horns could represent. Remember, in the book of Revelation, generally whenever we see the figure of a horn, it indicates authority or power. Well, the Roman Empire was made up of several geographic territories. They were known as provinces or senatorial provinces. And each one of those provinces fell under the control of a provincial governor. One of those that we are very familiar with was a man by the name of Pontius Pilate, a man who was serving as a governor. Well, as a rule, when the Roman Empire originally came to its power and the first supreme emperor came to power, a man by the name of Augustus, he passed a law that there was always to be, guess how many provinces? 10. There were always to be 10 provinces with 10 rulers. So look at this image that we see of this beast. What did I just say that the horns were representative of? Authority. And so we look at what was going on in the world at that time. Something that was very well known was that in Rome you have 10 senatorial provinces. Each one of them has a governor over them. Each one of them has a senator that goes to Rome and oversees certain aspects of that. And so these were things that very well would have aligned in the minds of those in the empire at that time. They would have been very familiar with that. It would be somewhat like if this was being delivered to us in the United States today and it was pictured with 50 heads. Well, how many states are there in the United States? There's 50 states. And so this image was one that was intended to draw their minds into what was going on around them, but it was doing it in such a way that only the Christians would understand. Another thing that I found very interesting is that with these governors, with these rulers, I saw one historical writing that said these governors, unless they ran afoul of the emperor and they were removed from office, they were only allowed to serve for 3.5 years. That's a figure that we've seen several times in Revelation, isn't it? So when you start looking at the history and you align that with what we see in Revelation, things start to become clear. We start to see a little bit more about what is going on here. Yes, ma'am.
Something I in a lot of sense wonder, if Revelation is being written to the Christians, why would they have been well versed in Daniel? Because the Jews ultimately rejected Christ and they were the ones that would have known Daniel. So how would the new Christians be well versed?
Well, you have to remember at this time the church has been an establishment for almost 75 years. And so at that time, just as we do today, they were still studying the Old Testament. And many of those, as I said, who spread to these parts of the Roman Empire, these were ones who became Christians on the day of Pentecost. And they went out and they carried their faith with them when they were scattered abroad. And so in most of these communities, you would have had those who had a knowledge of the Old Testament Scriptures. You would have had those who had been raised as Jews and would have been trained by the scribes from the earliest of ages about these prophecies and things of that nature. Well, those were things that people would have been teaching to others. And so what you would have had in these communities, yes, I'm sure that there were people there who did not have a knowledge of the Old Testament Scriptures who were Christians, but there were those there to teach and instruct them in those things, to guide them to a better understanding. And it's somewhat like we see in the church today. Jesus said that after we baptize a person into Christ, we're to teach them then to observe all things. Well, that is a lifelong effort, isn't it? I mean, we spend the rest of our life studying and learning and applying. and then sharing with others what it is that we learn. And so this is where we see all of this coming together. There would have been those in those communities that had been raised Jews. There would have been others who were converted as Gentiles, and they would not have had as deep of knowledge. Just like we see today, you take someone who was raised by Christian parents. They attended Bible classes the whole time growing up. They became a Christian and continued to grow in their knowledge. I think about Timothy and how from a young age he was taught in the Scriptures by his mother and his grandmother. But then you take someone, and we talked about this a little bit, I think, last Sunday morning or maybe 2 weeks ago. You take someone that was not raised with that tutelage, that was not brought up with that knowledge. It's going to take them a while to amass the knowledge that this person that grew up learning those things, say they've had 16, 18, 20, 25 years of teaching, and then someone comes in that has none of that. There's going to be a bit of a learning curve there. It's going to take them a while to learn the things that maybe we've known for many years, because it's something that's been ingrained in us from a young age.
Do you know if there was any apocryphal language going on with the non-Jews?
Not that I've seen. This was something that was really popular mainly among the Jews. And from some of the things that I've seen, a lot of the reason that this was developed among the Jews was because they saw themselves, and of course they were God's chosen nation for all those years. And there were things that they were privy to that others weren't. And so they developed their own forms of communication and things that they would have understood that others wouldn't. And kind of going along that same line, going back to what I mentioned earlier, you take someone that grew up going to church, they're going to have an entirely different vocabulary when it comes to religious matters than someone that was not raised in that type of setting, that was raised in a worldly family, and then came to become a Christian later in life. You also see that, we talked earlier about the different cultures that we see. I can remember when I was in college over at Crowley's Ridge, we had a couple of young men that were from the Sudan, Africa. And, we would use a lot of our southern figures of speech. They had no idea what we were talking about. Those of us from Arkansas, we understood. Like I can remember one day someone came into a classroom and made the statement, "It's raining cats and dogs." They both jumped up and ran to the windows because they didn't understand the figures of speech. And so we can see that in the Jewish culture. The Romans, I'm sure, they had their forms of communication that the Jews weren't privy to. And as I said, we even see that still in the cultures around us today. I know that in some of the business dealings that I've had, especially with the people from the Marshall Islands that have come into our community, they don't understand a lot of the things that take place around here. They don't understand a lot of the language. They don't understand a lot of the customs. But on the flip side, we don't understand a lot of their customs and things. And so there is a degree of learning that has to take place there. And so we see that with this as well.
Truth is truth.
Truth is truth. Yes, sir. Truth is truth.
Jews look for a perfect kingdom. Our Lord had to move them out of that. And the apostles.
That's right. But
Paul has a problem with the Jews because they had built their own law, not what Moses. Jesus said, if you believe Moses, you believe me.
that's right. That's right. And what was happening was, as you said, they were developing their own law. They were developing their own interpretations of the law. But as you said, truth is truth. A lot of times we hear people talking about, the Bible's hard to understand, or there's contradictions in the Bible, things of that nature. Folks, the things that I read in the Bible that pertain to our soul's salvation are very easy to understand. And the reason that is because, as Byron said, truth is truth. And regardless of the language, regardless of the culture, it's not very hard to understand, repent, and be baptized for the remission of your sins. Now, we could get off into some of the cultural things that we read in the Bible, and we could see where there would be some misunderstanding based upon the culture where a person lives. For instance, we talked a couple of months back on the question and answer night about some of the cultures that we see with people wearing head coverings or not wearing head coverings, the types of interactions that women have with men in other cultures. There's things that we have to look at that may be different in our culture than it is in other parts of the world, and it doesn't necessarily mean that our culture is right and they're wrong. It's just that's how they choose to live. That's how their custom is set up. Okay. Any other questions up to this point? All right, notice it says that the beast, it has 10 horns, but it has how many heads? Has 7 heads. This more than likely is in reference to the fact that the ancient city of Rome was built upon 7 different hills. And those hills, and I did not put them in my notes because I don't think I could pronounce the names of all of them, but there were 7 hills that made up the boundaries of the ancient city of Rome. And so once again, drawing people's minds back to who this first beast is, we see either further evidence pointing us to the fact that this is referring to the Roman Empire. But also, we see that these 7 hills were ones that were pictured a lot in things such as Roman mythology, Roman religious beliefs and practices, even some of the government policies that they had. These 7 hills. And also, it was sometimes even used as somewhat of a marketing ploy. Sometimes we talk about Randolph County being a county of 5 rivers. Well, Rome was known as a city of 7 hills, or a city of 7 mountains. And so this was something that people would come to see. And this was something that drew people in. And it became somewhat a moniker of the city. But also another thing that these 7 heads could be referring to are the 7 Roman emperors that served from Augustus to Domitian. And I'm going to try to pronounce these. We see that technically there were 10 emperors during this time, but we'll talk about why only 7 of them generally are accepted. We have Augustus, then Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian, Titus, and then Domitian. 3 of these emperors, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, are generally not accepted as full-fledged Roman emperors. They are not seen as having attained the position of Caesar or supreme emperor. And the reason that is because each one of them served for less than 1 year, and it was only during times of war. There were battles taking place between these emperors. They were trying to determine who was going to be Caesar. But ultimately, all 3 of them died in war. And none of them ever reached the position of becoming supreme emperor. And so we look at these other 7 emperors from Augustus to Domitian. And each one of these, they reigned with such power, such distinction, that at the point of their death, temples were built in their honor. They were named gods of the Roman Empire, and worship begun to be extended to them. Now, these are the 7 leading up to Domitian. When Domitian came on the scene, everything changed. Because when Domitian became emperor, he thought that he needed to be worshipped while he was still living. He thought that he was far superior to everyone else who had ever served, and that he had attained the position of God while still in this life. And so he had a temple built to himself, and he demanded that every Roman citizen had to bow down and worship him. Those who refused, they were subject to a variety of different types of punishment, different types of torture. Some of them were exiled out of the empire, and many of them were put to death. But what about verse 3? Look at Revelation 13:3 for just a moment. And we're just about out of time. But in 13:3 it says, "And I saw one of his heads as though it had been smitten unto death, and his death stroke was healed." Now there are many different theories as to what this death blow was referring to. One of the most popular is that it's referring to the crushing of Satan's head that was prophesied back in Genesis 3 and verse 15. And they say that this head was crushed when Jesus died on the cross. Now, I want you to remember, this figure is not of Satan himself. This figure is not representative of Satan himself. It is something other than the dragon or Satan, which therefore would not make sense for us to say that this is talking about Jesus crushing the head of Satan, because the beast is not an image for Satan. But John mentioned this death blow to one of the 7 heads. Now remember who I said the 7 heads were more than likely referring to. The emperors, from Augustus up through Titus. Now, what would this mean to the Christians living at the end of the first century when they were thinking about these 7 emperors, but one of them had gone through something very tragic? Something terrible had happened. Well, on July the 18th in 64 AD, during the middle of the night, something took place in Rome. A great fire broke out. Now, at the time, no one knew what the cause of this fire was. But soon the fire was described as having seemingly took on a life of its own. And by the time that the fire was finally extinguished, after 6 days and 7 nights of burning, there were only 3 of Rome's 14 districts that were still standing. Just about the entire city was destroyed. The emperor at the time was a man by the name of Nero. Nero is the one that set the fire. He wanted to rebuild certain districts of Rome. He thought that they were falling into disrepair, and he wanted to rebuild this and take on the glory of the one that had rebuilt the city. So he went out and he set the fire. But he did this under cover of darkness because he didn't want anyone to know that he was the one that did it. But little did he know that there were certain citizens of the city of Rome that witnessed him do this. And they began to spread around the city that the emperor was the one that did this. His reputation began to be tarnished. And he realized something's got to be done. I am going to lose my position. I'm going to lose the influence of the people. And so he told a lie. He told the citizens of the city of Rome that it was not him that was behind the fire, but it was this strange group of people known as Christians. And as a result of this, there was a time of persecution against the church during the time of Nero. It was not nearly as severe as it was during the time of Domitian. But we see that in this, there was a mark against this emperor. He was not seen as one of great honor. Great pride was not applied to him after this point. But we're out of time. We have people waiting to come in, so we're going to stop there for this evening. We're almost through with this section, so we'll sum this up next Wednesday night, and then we'll get into discussion of the second beast.